Mary woke up with a start when the alarm clock rang. She reached over and quickly turned it off, then paused to make sure Mike was still asleep. Hearing soft snoring, she relaxed, glad that he did not wake up. Mike hated getting up in the morning before the last possible moment that allowed him to get ready for work. She carefully climbed out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake the children. First was Amanda, who woke up smiling and reaching out for a hug. Mary hugged the adorable 5-year-old girl and kissed her forehead, telling her she loved her. She lifted the baby out of bed and sent her to the bathroom to wash up, and then went across the hallway to wake Mikey. Michael Jr., or Mikey, was more like his father in the morning. He would wake up in a bad mood and had to be coaxed into moving. She made him stand up and went to prepare breakfast for everyone. As soon as the children sat down at the table and began to eat, she returned to the bedroom to wake Mike. She called him softly from the doorway. "It's time to get up, sleepyhead." He groaned as he woke up, then mumbled and swung his legs to the floor. "Did you iron my shirts yesterday?" Mary replied, "I ironed the ones hanging on the ironing board." Mike looked at the selection. "Today I want to wear the blue one." "I'll stroke it for you while you shower," she replied. It was difficult for her to do this and get the children ready on time, but making sacrifices is what loving wives do for their husbands, she thought bitterly. The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of activity for Mary, getting the kids dressed, ironing Mike's shirt, getting Mikey onto the bus, and getting Amanda into the minivan in time to pick up 2 more kids from her preschool drop-off group. When she stopped to pick up William, a sweet little boy whose birthday was just a week after Amanda's, his mom came to the minivan window to say hello. "Good morning, Mary. How are you today?" "Okay, thank you. How about you, Vicky?" "Great. Looking forward to finishing a project at work this week. My boss seems very pleased with the results." "That's great. Congratulations," replied Mary, wishing she had an interesting job to look forward to now that the children were both in school during the day. However, Mike was categorically against her returning to work. It seemed illogical to her, but she did not have the strength to convince him to reconsider his opinion. After she picked up her 3rd child and dropped them all off at school, she headed home. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw her neighbors, Kim and Rick, leaving the house. Rick kissed Kim and got into his Jeep, and Kim turned and waved to Mary. They were a few years older than her and Mike. They had kids in high school, but they kissed in public like newlyweds. Mary wished Mike would be more affectionate in this way. She wondered if the local gossip was true. The rumor was that Kim and Rick had an open marriage. When she heard this from another neighbor, she had to ask Mike what it meant. His response was that this means Kim is a corrupt bitch. She didn't continue because she felt like her question had angered Mike, and she had to be careful not to upset him. Eventually, she learned from internet research that open marriages involve one or both partners having sexual relations with other people outside of marriage, with the knowledge and consent of the other partner. Mary found this idea shocking and was surprised that her polite, friendly, and seemingly normal neighbors would hide this secret if it were true. She wasn't a prude, but she was quite sheltered as a child and remained a virgin when she met Mike her sophomore year of college. They started dating, and when she told him that she wouldn't have sex with him because she was waiting until marriage, he was the first guy to continue asking her out after he found out. In fact, he insisted that they date exclusively, and they became engaged when they graduated from college 2 years later. The relationship wasn't ideal, she thought. Mike was quite quiet and didn't talk much about his feelings. He also had a short temper and would become very jealous if she talked to other men or even smiled at them. Mike expected her to spend most of her time with him when they weren't in class. At first, she was flattered by his constant attention. It seemed that he could not bear to be separated from her. However, about a year into their marriage, his possessive feelings turned into something darker. He would get into moods where he would frown and refuse to talk to her. When she tried to ask him about it and get him to open up, he attacked her verbally and became emotionally abusive. Eventually, she realized that he got upset when she mentioned anything about work, which included her work relationships with her coworkers, unless she was complaining about something. She learned to only share her frustrations, but this led to Mike telling her that she should think about quitting her job, so she just stopped talking about work altogether. Then, a year after graduation and marriage, she became pregnant with Mikey. She was delighted, and so was Mike. The relationship between them had improved significantly, and she was really enjoying the changes happening in her body. She felt more feminine than she had ever felt in her life, and appreciated the encouraging comments she received from friends and family as her due date approached. After giving birth, Mike suggested that she stay home with Mikey for the first year or so, and it seemed reasonable to her based on what she had read about how babies benefit from being close to their parents for the first year of life. She quit her job and devoted all her attention to her son. It was the happiest time in their marriage. When Mikey turned 2, Mary broached the topic of returning to work. Her mother lived nearby and offered to look after the child during the day, and Mary was worried that she would lose her job skills and have difficulty finding work if she stayed out of work any longer. Mike was non-committal about the idea, but it was important to Mary, so she persisted. She admitted to Mike that it wasn't all about work. She said she felt cut off from everyone except him and their son, and needed companionship with other adults. For some reason, Mike took this to mean she wanted to meet other men. He became furious and called her an approachable girl. She realized he was getting into one of his moods, so she dropped the topic and let him calm down. The atmosphere in the house was tense, and even Mikey seemed more reserved. Mary kept herself apart, and the situation gradually returned to normal. Then Mike went out with the guys after work one Friday night. Mary stayed home and played with Mikey, then put him to bed around 8 o'clock. She read the book until 11 and finally decided to go to bed. Just as she turned off the light, she heard the garage door open. Mike was at home. He entered the bedroom and, clumsily taking off his clothes in the dark, fell onto the bed. Mary turned on the bedside light, and Mike looked at her sullenly. "Are you okay?" she asked with concern. "Shut up," he shouted. "I'm sure you and Mikey would do just fine without me. Then you could move in with your boyfriend." "What are you talking about?" Mary screamed. "Which guy?" Mike raised his hand and hit Mary so hard on the cheek that she flew back onto the bed. She thought that seeing stars was a figure of speech, but as she lay there in a daze, she actually saw points of light swirling around her field of vision. She was so shocked that she could not speak. Mike, drunk as he was, seemed to realize the magnitude of his offense. He climbed over Mary and began to apologize. He cried, rubbing his face against hers. She put her hand on his cheek, gradually coming to her senses. Before she could say anything, his lips touched hers, softly apologizing. His kiss became passionate as he misinterpreted her passivity as forgiveness. He forced his tongue into her mouth, and Mary fought a wave of nausea. Mike tore at her pajamas, tearing off the buttons on the top and pulling down her pants until he caught them with his foot and kicked them off. Mary froze with fear. Mike had never hit her before, and her instincts of self-preservation told her to lie still and not provoke him. Mary lay motionless beneath him until he finished and rolled away. She realized she had been holding her breath and let herself exhale, watching Mike out of the corner of her eye. Soon he began to snore, and Mary quietly got up, put on her pajama pants, and went to her son's room. It wasn't until she was sure Mikey was still asleep, and she lay down on the daybed next to the crib that she allowed herself to cry. She was shocked by what happened, but deep down a voice told her that she knew this day would come someday. She wanted to scream at that voice and tell it to shut up. Instead, she decided that she would never let Mike hit her again. The next morning, Mary looked at the bruise on her face in the mirror as Mike begged her to forgive him. She wasn't as upset as she had been the night before, but she was now twice as wary of him. He continued to beg and promised to never hurt her again. She told him that he had anger problems and that he needed to talk to someone about it. He promised that he would do it. In the end, she told him that she forgave him, just to get him to shut up and give her some peace. He thanked her enthusiastically and told her what a loving wife she was. This phrase seemed so strange to her in this situation that it stuck in her head. She was ashamed of the incident and told no one what had happened, although her neighbors and the pastor at church all seemed to be looking at her cheek the following week, despite her attempts to hide the bruise with makeup. Of course, Mike never sought counseling, and the only time she mentioned it was when he let her know with his eyes that she shouldn't bring it up again. Mike really treated her better and tried to be helpful, at least for a few months. Then Mary realized she was pregnant again. She figured it happened on the very night Mike attacked her. Second pregnancy was easier than the first in terms of adapting to the changes in her body, but Mary did not enjoy it as much due to her concerns about the environment she was bringing the child into. Mike didn't hit her again after that terrible night, but he increasingly fell into his old argumentative and bullying ways. When Amanda was born, Mary again felt great happiness and joy holding the baby in her arms. Mikey seemed to have gotten used to the fact that he was now sharing her attention with his new sister, and everyone in the house relaxed and moved on without incident. The question of returning to work was again postponed for at least another year. Mary perked up, coming out of her thoughts. 5 years passed, and she continued to deal with Mike's moods and anger issues. There was no more physical abuse, but she still had to endure his verbal abuse. She knew that the relative calm was not a result of Mike's improvement, but the result of her becoming more cautious. The following week, Mary went to pick up her mail and found a book addressed to her in the mailbox. She unfolded it and found a copy of the book, Victim No Longer Surviving Spousal Abuse. She opened the book, and inside was a card. It was from Vicky, the mother of little William in her ride-along group. The note read, "I know it's none of my business, but I thought this might help you. If you need to talk, let me know. Vicky." Mary's first reaction was anger. Of course, it's none of her business. But then she felt a second wave of emotion, this time despair. All her efforts to hide her shame were obviously in vain. If Vicky knew what was going on from their brief morning greetings, then who else knew or suspected? She took the book into the house and made a cup of coffee. Then she sat down and began to read. The next morning, when Vicky walked out to the car with William, Mary exchanged pleasantries with her. As Vicky buckled the baby into the seat behind her, Mary gathered her courage. Vicky waved at her and started to walk away, and Mary blurted out, "Vicky?" Vicky turned and looked at her. "Thanks for the book." Vicky smiled sadly and said, "I hope this helps. Let me know if you need to talk." Mary paused, then asked, "How did you know?" Vicky walked closer to the car and glanced at the children chatting and laughing in the back seat to make sure they weren't listening. "Mikey is talking to Billy," she said. "Billy said Mikey told him that his daddy yells at his mommy a lot and it scares him." When Mary heard this, her face turned pale. She couldn't keep looking Vicky in the eye. Vicky reached out the window and placed her hand on Mary's in a comforting gesture. Mary looked at her and said, "Thank you. I need to get these kids to school." "Are you sure everything is okay?" Vicky asked. Mary nodded and squeezed the hand that Vicky offered her. They smiled at each other as the car pulled out of the driveway. Over the next 2 weeks, Mary spent a lot of time reading the book. She was particularly interested in reading about the motivations and insecurities that motivated the aggressors. She read and reread the section on triggers for verbal and physical abuse and realized that she had become an expert at avoiding Mike's triggers. But the most interesting and informative section was about how to deal with violence in relationships. It emphasized the importance of reporting violence, having a support network, and the need for the abuser to get help. Mary became despondent, realizing that she had done nothing right in her situation. She did not report Mike's physical attack to the police or seek help for her injury. She had no one to talk to understand that the problem was entirely his and that she was not to blame for what had happened. Most importantly, Mike refused to acknowledge the problem and seek help. The last chapter was about leaving an abusive relationship. Reading it, Mary became scared. The book said that most abusers who don't get help don't get better on their own. In fact, they usually get worse. Once physical abuse begins, it usually becomes more frequent, and many abusers begin to attack other family members. The book emphasized the need for careful planning when leaving a relationship, having a safe place to stay, informing a trusted friend of your plans, and taking your children with you. The author strongly recommended seeking a court order prohibiting the abuser from approaching the family, but cautioned that such orders are not always granted unless there is a history of physical abuse and allegations of violence have been reported to the police. Mary thought a lot about her situation. She carefully hid the book every evening before Mike returned from work. She realized that she did not understand her husband very well, despite the fact that they had recently celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary. She decided to investigate. She checked the computer in his office to see what he was doing at night, while she bathed the children and put them to bed. She opened the page, and there was a list of stories in the loving wives category. She read a few and, having become accustomed to the erotic content, discovered that they fell into 2 categories. Most of the stories were about sharing wives. About 80% of the stories in the loving wives category were about this. Another large category included revenge stories, where husbands took revenge on cheating wives by engaging in complex and sometimes violent revenge plots. She didn't like the stories about sharing wives. Some of them included men who insisted that their wives sleep with other men, and she remembered her neighbors. How could a man truly love his wife and want her to do so, she wondered. It was beyond her understanding that some couples actually felt this way. However, she had to admit that if what they said about her neighbors was true, they somehow made it and seemed as close as any other couple she knew. She found out that another, smaller category of stories was called BTB, or Burn the Bitch stories, and she really didn't like those stories. They usually involved a woman having an affair and her husband finding out. Sometimes the husband confronted his wife and kicked her out or left himself. Many of these stories then described how the husband developed elaborate plans to publicly humiliate his wife, fire her, leave her without money or housing, or cause her emotional pain. In some extreme cases, the husband killed his wife. Mary was amazed by these stories. In most of them, the wife made only one mistake, and the husband's reaction was completely disproportionate to this. Can a husband ever really love his wife if she made a mistake, and he refused to forgive her when she begged for another chance? She couldn't understand it. The authors of some stories seemed to suggest that a man was allowed to do any horrible and violent thing to a woman if she had broken her marital vows. To Mary, the men in these stories seemed like people who were actively looking for a reason to abuse their wife. She didn't think she could ever trust a man who would treat another person like that, no matter the reason. Other sites in the browser's history have been news and political sites. She didn't feel like she had learned anything new, so she decided to do a study of monitoring other people's internet activity. One of the interesting things was a tool called a keylogger. It allowed you to track activity on your computer by recording every key pressed into a hidden text file that could be viewed later. It also captured the URLs of all pages opened in the browser. She read reviews of them and found several that were considered safe and free. She downloaded one with a high rating out of curiosity and installed it on her computer. She thought she had made a mistake because nothing happened after activation. Even when she entered a sequence of control keys to open a hidden file, the computer did not respond. She returned to the company's website to reread the instructions. She realized that the password prompt was invisible. It was necessary to enter it after the control sequence without a pop-up window. This time, when she completed the sequence, she immediately entered the password. Even though nothing happened on the screen when she entered the password, as soon as she pressed Enter, a window opened showing the text that had been entered since the software started. In one part of the window, there were keystrokes, and next to it, in another tab, there were URLs. She saw the company's website URL and the search terms she had entered to research the topic of running software and accessing the history file. She smiled to herself and cleared the cached data. Then she closed the window and turned off the computer. The software was configured to start when the computer was turned on. Over the next few days, she checked the computer every morning after Mike left for work to see what the keylogger had recorded. She found records from news sites that indicated he was viewing them daily, and then came across lengthy texts he had entered into a sex site. These notes were difficult to read because the file contained literally every key he pressed, and Mike was not a very good typist. She reread the software's display settings and found that she could switch between displaying all characters as they were entered and a display that interpreted the key sequence, like most word processors, removing backspace keystrokes and deleted characters. When she did this, his text became much easier to read. It appears that he left comments on stories on the site. Some of them were positive and contained phrases like, "The bitch got what she deserved." Others were critical, or more accurately, they were juvenile tirades and personal attacks on the author. She opened the URLs in the list by clicking on them and was able to identify his comments at the end of each story on the site. She was alarmed by what she found. He criticized all stories that described the voluntary division of wives. Some of his posts were so childish and unfounded that she felt ashamed. She noticed that he always wrote anonymously, and several times he left more than one comment on some stories he didn't like. The comments on BTB stories were really scary for her. He liked all these stories, and his praise was always greatest for the stories where the husband caused his wife the most pain. He wrote about stories as if they really happened and addressed the characters in them as if they were real people. She learned 3 things about Mike from this. He believed that any punishment is justified for a cheating wife, even murder. He couldn't separate fiction from reality, and he identified with the husbands in stories about cheating wives. It reminded her of his crazy accusation that she had a boyfriend before the first attack. Where did this come from? A couple of days later, she returned home from the grocery store just before noon to find Mike's pickup truck in the driveway. She didn't expect him at home at this time, and his presence caused alarm in her mind. She parked the minivan next to his truck and carried the grocery bags into the house. She found Mike sitting at the kitchen table with a book in front of him. She realized that she must have forgotten to put it away before heading to the store and mentally scolded herself for being so stupid. She walked over to the table and placed the grocery bags on the countertop. "Hello, dear, you're back early," she said with as much feigned cordiality as possible. Mike's face was emotionless. "What is this?" he asked, pushing the book towards her with his finger. "This is a book that a friend gave me," answered Mary. "What is friend?" Mary panicked and realized that she could not say Vicky's real name. What if Mike wants to take revenge on her? Her name is Mary. She's one of the moms who drops their kids off at Amanda's school in the morning. She said she read an interesting book and wanted to give it to me. I didn't even look at the cover. I just brought it home and threw it on the table before. How to go to the store. The words came out of her as quickly as she could say them. Even to her, she sounded empty and insincere. Mike looked at her with the same neutral expression. "Mary? Really? Same name as you?" Mary tried to meet his gaze. She nodded, but her upper lip began to twitch. This tick seemed to break the dam of Mike's anger. He jumped up, knocking over the kitchen chair. "Liar!" he shouted. Mary winced and took a step back, but Mike walked up to her and pushed her to the floor. When she fell, her left hand was underneath her, and the pain shot from it to her elbow. Once on the floor, she began to crawl away from him on her buttocks to the corner of the kitchen, trying to find shelter. "Your boyfriend gave it to you, right?" he shouted. "I don't have a boyfriend," Mary howled. Mike grabbed a can of soup from the bag on the table and threw it at her. Mary covered herself with her hands, and the can hit her chest like a blow to the body. "Stop it!" she screamed, jumping up and stretching out her arms towards him. Her sudden, bold stance stunned Mike, and he actually stopped the attack. He seemed to have gained control of his anger, but there was no spontaneous expression of remorse as 6 years ago. He looked around the kitchen and said, "I'll be back later. I want this mess cleaned up when I get back." With these words, he turned around and left the house, slamming the door. Mary didn't move until she heard the truck start up and the tires screech as it pulled out of the driveway. Once the sound died down, Mary allowed herself 5 minutes of self-pity, sobbing and clutching her injured hand to her chest. She lifted her shirt and checked her ribs. They hurt, but not as much as the brush. She looked at her watch. There was less than an hour left before Amanda had to be picked up from school. She felt much calmer and full of strong determination. She called her mom and asked her for a favor. The pickup truck returned to the house 6 hours later. The driver parked in the same spot next to the minivan, got out of the truck, and staggered into the house. No one on the street noticed this, since in most houses it was lunch hour. The house fell silent again and remained dark for another 15 minutes. Then there was a loud bang and a bright flash of light from the office window. Kim and Rick looked at each other when they heard the pop. They watched the evening news while sitting on the couch. Neither said a word, although both wondered if it had been a gunshot. 20 or 30 seconds later, they heard a woman scream. Rick jumped up and told Kim to call the police. As he ran to the front door, Kim screamed for him to stop. He looked back at her and she said, "Please be careful." He nodded and looked out the door before opening it. An hour later, Kim sat next to Mary on the couch in Mary's house, while Mary stared blankly at the empty fireplace. The police spoke with Rick in the hallway. "So you didn't hear or see anything from that house before the shot?" The middle-aged detective asked Rick. "No. Kim and I both got home around 5:30, then made dinner and sat down to watch the news. The gunshot was the first thing we heard from this house this evening." "And you're not close with?" The detective looked at his notes. "Mary or the deceased?" Rick looked around the neat interior of the house. "No, this is the first time we've been here. Mary and Mike didn't host or socialize as far as we know. They kept to themselves." The detective thanked Rick and released him to his wife, who was talking quietly to the still almost comatose Mary. Captain Hernandez, the senior police officer on duty, walked through the front door to find a detective talking with a crime scene photographer. "What do we have?" he asked. "I collected as many witness statements as I could. Nobody saw or heard anything before the shot was fired." "Where is Vanessa?" "Detective Scott is in the room with the body," he answered, pointing to the door next to the kitchen. Hernandez walked carefully to the door and looked inside before entering. Detective Vanessa Scott and the evidence technician carefully packed and labeled the items on the table. They were wearing gloves and shoe covers. "How far have you set the perimeter?" asked Hernandez Scott. "You can come to the front of that chair," she replied, pointing behind her. "Here's what we have," Detective Scott began. "The deceased's name is Mike Bronson. His wife Mary is on the sofa. He got home around 6 and he was drunk. His wife doesn't know where he was, but she suggested the names of 2 of his friends who could be asked. She offered him dinner, but he refused, which is unusual because she says he usually has dinner with her and the kids every night. As for the children, they are with Mother Mary tonight. She says she called her mother this morning and asked her to pick up the kids so she could spend the evening alone with her husband." Hernandez and Scott exchanged glances. She continued, "I checked upstairs. There was cooling foam in the bathtub and clean linen laid out on the bed. The wife says her husband went into the study and she returned upstairs to take a bath. She had barely gotten into the bathtub when she heard a gunshot. She ran downstairs and found him with it in his right hand." She handed Hernandez a packed pistol. Glock 19, 9mm. Full magazine, except for 1 bullet, which is in the wall. "We also found a note, still on the notepad." She handed another package to the captain. He read the note through the packaging. "Dear Mary, I can't take it anymore. I'm sorry." He read it aloud. "Not signed." Yes, most men sign their notes. Women often don't. It's also weird that there's a greeting but no signature, and it's a very short note, even for a man. Usually, if they leave a note, it's longer. "So the wife discovered it first?" "Yes. The neighbor says he found her with her hands on her husband's shoulders and her forehead pressed against his when he came in. The gun was on the floor under the deceased's right arm. We made her change into different clothes and packed the ones she was wearing to check for traces of blood and gunpowder. Upon visual inspection, I did not find anything on the clothes. We also took gunpowder samples from her hands as well as his hands, and she voluntarily gave fingerprints. You told her to talk to a lawyer first, right? Detective Scott gave the captain a disapproving look and said nothing. The gun was kept in a drawer, along with a box of 9mm cartridges. The box was full, except for the 15 that were in the store. Mary says her husband bought the gun several years ago. She states that she has never used it or touched it. Gun or ammo. Doesn't know if he ever fired it before until tonight. No lock on the trigger or the box it was in. We'll take fingerprints from everything, of course. I checked the rest of the house and found nothing. Everyone was silent for a minute, then Detective Scott added, Mary has an injured wrist. I think she tried to hide it from me when we arrived, but when I asked, she said she fell while picking up groceries. Story checks out. There's a torn bag in the trash. Potatoes and a few dented cans and plastic jars in the pantry. Okay, great job, said Captain Hernandez. Let's call it a day here and let them take the body. Later that week, Vanessa stopped by the captain's office. Do you have a minute, Hank? He raised his head and said, Sure, come in and sit down, Vanessa. We have received lab results on Bronson's case. Is there anything interesting? He asked. No, everything is as expected. His prints are on the gun and bullets, but not hers. Gunshot residue is on his right hand and arm, but not on her or her clothes. Seems all clear, considering the note he left, the captain concluded. Yes, but there's something bothering me about this case. When we started talking to relatives and neighbors, everyone seemed to be hinting at problems in the marriage. The neighbors heard screams, mostly from him, and some thought he might be is physically aggressive towards her. But we have no record of domestic violence calls to this address, right? And no record from the doctors or hospital of any injuries. Right. I just keep thinking about the way she looked at me when I first arrived, Vanessa said. She was crying like the neighbor said, and I asked if she was okay. She just nodded and stood there next to her husband's body while I talked to her. Finally, I asked if she wanted to go somewhere else. I mean, the scene was pretty gruesome. Do you know what she said? Tell me, answered the captain. She said, I'd rather stay here. When I asked why, she replied, it's what a loving wife should do. Mary sat next to her boyfriend on the sofa. Mikey and Amanda were playing happily on the floor in front of them. She looked at Steve and smiled. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her towards him. A year has passed since that terrible night happened. The children were too young to understand, but the anniversary brought back unwanted memories for Mary. She must have been thinking about the wonderful man next to her, she thought. She met him at work when she returned to work as an accountant. He was divorced, but was a good man. He listened to her and was able to talk about his feelings. Most importantly, she had never heard him say a word in anger. Instead, she found herself drawn back into that night, remembering what had happened. When Mike returned home after their fight, he was drunk, for which Mary thanked God many times since then. He staggered in and plopped down on the sofa. Mary approached him cautiously and asked what he wanted for dinner. He said he wasn't hungry. He asked where the children were, and Mary replied that they were with her mother for the night. This seemed to get to him, and he told Mary that she could not leave him. He didn't look threatening when he said this, but rather tired and worried. You need to deal with your anger, she told him. He quickly agreed, which showed Mary that he was no more sincere this time than before. She had the book in her hands and told him that she was going to return it to her friend, but she needed his help with something. I want to write her a note, she said, but my wrist is hurt and I can't hold a pen. I need you to write a note for me. If he hadn't been drunk and trying to appease her, Mike would probably have questioned why there was a note when she could just give the book to her friend. Instead, he allowed her to lead him into his office and sit him down at his desk. She dictated to him what to write, and he tried to write legibly. When he finished, she told him to stay put, and she would get him an aspirin and a glass of water. Mike grunted and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes due to the headache. When Mary returned 5 minutes later, He did not even turn to her. If he had turned around, he might have asked what she was wearing. Mary saw that he was still sitting in the chair with his eyes closed. She knew she might never have another chance like this. She walked towards him decisively and raised her right hand. When the gun was 6 inches from his temple, she pulled the trigger. If she hadn't prepared in advance, she might have froze when the gun went off. It sounded much louder than she expected. She studied the gun and how to shoot it on YouTube using a tablet computer at an internet cafe. The videos prepared her to check the gun, load it, and get it ready to fire, but it was still a surprise when the gun actually went off. She knew she only had a few minutes before someone came to check on the noise, and she needed to act quickly. She checked her gloved hands. She then rubbed the back of her gloved right hand across the back of Mike's right hand. She hoped that enough gunpowder residue would transfer to his hand for it to be detected. She placed the gun in his right hand and curled his fingers around the handle, then released her hand, and the gun fell to the carpet beneath her. She took off the thin plastic painter's overalls she was wearing over her clothes, and the gloves taped to the sleeves came off with it, just as she had rehearsed. She rolled it up, inside out, and then lifted the grate in the floor of the heating system and pushed the wad of plastic as deep as she could. When she returned the grill to its place, nothing was visible in the dark air duct. She turned off the air flow to that duct at the junction box in the basement, so the furnace wouldn't blow out evidence of her crime when the police were here. Satisfied, she turned back to her husband. Now that she was no longer on autopilot, the gravity and horror of what she had done washed over her. She didn't have to pretend when she let out a terrified scream. The investigation into the shooting was complex. She didn't think Detective Scott believed everything she said, but there didn't seem to be enough inconsistencies to warrant further investigation. The case was ruled a suicide, and the body was returned to her after an autopsy. She cremated Mike and held a small funeral ceremony. It was mostly family members and a few of Mike's work colleagues. Her neighbors, Rick and Kim, stopped by too. Everyone tried to console her, but she struggled with the guilt of killing her husband. She had lonely days and suicidal thoughts for months, but she did what she did for the sake of her children, and their unconditional love helped her get through that dark period. Mike had insurance at work that paid out enough to keep them alive for a few months. She was surprised the insurance paid out because the death was ruled a suicide, but she learned that some policies only last if the insured held them long enough. There wasn't much money, but she wanted to get out of the house she shared with Mike. She put it up for sale and found a 3-room apartment that she liked. The house sold in less than 2 months, and she was able to buy an apartment. Her job search led her to an accounting firm as a bookkeeper. She did well and was quickly promoted to junior accountant because the firm realized she had skills that could lead to a move to another company if she wasn't promoted. Having established her career, she focused on her children. She was concerned about the emotional trauma caused by the loss of her father and signed them up for couples counseling. The counselor worked with all of them, and the children seemed to be adjusting well. She realized in the process that Mike's lack of attention to the children and their fear of his outbursts probably made the transition to life without him easier. All that was left was for her to deal with her own guilt. Looking back, she realized that she had behaved wrongly with Mike from the very beginning. His obsession with her was unhealthy, and she should have sought help for them once he became violent. By keeping everything a secret, she made the situation worse, and the way out was also worse. If she had the opportunity to do it all over again, she would simply take the children and leave. Of course, there would be a risk in that, but she took huge risks with what she did. Most women who leave abusive relationships end up okay. Mary pushed aside the dark memories of her mistakes and turned to Steve. She wasn't sure she deserved him, given her history, but she did everything she could to convince herself that she did. "I think I love you," she told him. He smiled and kissed her. "I know I love you," he replied. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the